The new multi-tool with hundreds of uses in your everyday life, it's Fragments of Silicon.
All right, welcome to another installment of Fragments of Silicon, the Daylight Interviews. Joining us this week is Robert Boyd of Zeboyd Games.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No problem, no problem. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while, as I have played many of your games and have enjoyed them, but we'll get to that in a bit. How we like to start out is I like to ask the people behind the games there's in the studio their personal stories, and we do this by asking this particular question: what got you interested in video games, both on a personal and a professional level?
Sure. Yeah, so when I was very little, my parents brought home an Atari 5200, and I had a lot of fun with that, so that's how I got started playing games.
Okay, I think the
So
5200 might be a new one on the bingo board.
I think so. Like, or it certainly doesn't come up. Like, I think that's right up there with the Intellivision recently.
yeah, I mean, it wasn't the most popular system at the time. And then, a few years later, the Nintendo Entertainment System came out, and everybody loved that. So yeah, I got started there with making video games as a teenager. I messed around with, just modding that kind of stuff. I used a program called Verge RPG, which was kind of like RPG Maker, but more indie. And then I want to say about 15 years ago, um, Xbox 360 started their big Xbox Live Indie Games program, which I thought looked super interesting. And about that time, I played a game called Retro Game Challenge, which is a collection. Oh, yeah, I heard a sound, so you probably are familiar with that.
I actually own a copy of that.
Yeah, it's a really good game, and it's a collection for those people who haven't played it of fake classic games, and they pretend like they're real. So basically, it's like an indie game collection. And one of the games within a game was a retro style RPG, which I played and thought, hey, this doesn't look too complicated. I bet I could make something like this. So soon after that, I, started making RPGs. I made Breath of Death 7, Cthulhu Saves the World, and then we took those two games and put them on Steam, and they did very well for us. And after that, I've just kept making games.
Well, it's good that it all panned out that way. Like, gotta admit, I wasn't expecting Retro Game Challenge to be dropped ever, but it's always because I did play that game quite extensively, and it's a bit culturally dense, but that makes sense given that it's based off of Game Center CX, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, I believe that's correct.
Like, now, did you have any prior relationship to JRPGs before Retro Game Challenge? Or was that really the lightning bolt here?
I mean, I had played them for years and years, but I hadn't done anything too professional. I wrote one of the early guides in English for soul hackers, way back on the Sega Saturn. Um, that was up on GameFAQs, and I did a translation patch for an old Super Nintendo RPG based on the Slayers anime, which, yeah,
I am
wasn't
at
a
least
full.
slightly familiar with that one. Would have been nice to be able to play that back in the day.
Mm.
Yeah, my Japanese was far from fluent, so as well as my hacking skills weren't very good either. So basically, I just went through and like hacked a bunch of the ability names, that kind of thing, into English. So it made it a little easier to play, but you still had a lot of stuff you needed
That
Japanese
animation looks
for.
like a dragon slave, right?
Exactly.
Oh.
But yeah, I didn't have a whole lot of professional experience before then. I didn't really study programming professionally. I just kind of did it as a hobby for years and years, and then, like I said, with the Xbox 360 indie game program, that's when I thought, oh, I wonder if I could do something here.
Mm. That would be coding in XNA, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, that's correct. X and A and C sharp.
Yeah. It's been a long while since we've discussed that on the channel. Not unfamiliar. It's just, it's been a long time since the Xbox Live Indie channel was an actual thing that existed.
It's been deprecated for what, a decade?
Um,
Something like that.
let's
Like,
see. I think the last game I released on it was in 2020, not 2013. So about a decade, but people kept making it for a few years after that. And then a few years after that, you could still buy games on the surface, even if nobody was really releasing anything.
right. Like, so what was the experience like going through the Xbox Live Indie channel and its tool sets?
Yeah, so I really enjoyed X and A. I thought, it simplified a lot of the really complex elements of game development, but still gave you a lot of freedom over how you program things. So I thought it was a great system for someone like me who had just a really basic knowledge of programming, but didn't have all the nitty gritties about getting the ultimate performance out of your code and stuff like that. The actual service with submitting games and review was very, very different than I think anything really before or after, in that all of um, the whole review system was handled by the community itself. So you'd put your game up for review, and then you would go and look at the other games that were up for review, and you download them and play them, and either pass them or fail them based on some basic criteria. Like they had various tests they wanted us to do to, like, for example, a big one was screen safe area, where you weren't allowed to put text really close to the edge of the screen because some people had TVs that had overscan on them.
Hmm.
So you had a bunch of tests like that you were supposed to run through, but the whole thing was run, almost entirely by the community, with very little direct input from Microsoft, other than them making all the programs that we were using.
Hmm.
Hmm. And I'm assuming the community liked your games.
Yeah, I mean, they everybody seemed, in just in general, everyone was very supportive. There weren't really any bad faith actors that I can think of. you know if you got failed, it was for a legitimate reason, and people weren't holding grudges. um the funny thing is, before I started making RPGs, I just kind of messed around with the system, and I was working on a text-based choose your own adventure game called Molly the Werezompire, and that ended up failing. I think it was for something that I thought was completely ridiculous. Like it failed because the controls would mess up if you had a guitar controller plugged in, um, which didn't seem like a valid fail to me because it's like why just unplug the guitar controller and then the game works. But
Yeah.
so you know that game was my first experience with getting failed through the community review system. But I took the time and made some fixes, and made another choose your own adventure game in the meantime while I was waiting to be able to resubmit. So it all turned out okay.
Well, that's good. Like, and as absurd as it is, I'm willing to bet paper money that the people who test that earnestly wanted to play your visual novel with a guitar controller. Just because.
I'm guessing they just had the guitar controller plugged in because they were playing Guitar Hero or something along those lines and didn't want to unplug the thing. But I've heard
Possible.
stranger things.
I mean, it's not this. I've heard people completing Dark Souls with the Guitar Hero controller, so it's within the realm of possibility.
Definitely.
Definitely. Anyway, so how successful were Breath of Death 7 and Cthulhu Saves the World on the Indie Games channel?
So on the Indie Games channel, Breath of Death 7 was the first game we released, well, the first RPG we released there, and it came out in March or April of 2010. And when it came out, I was very pleased because it, um, for a while, was the top rated game on the channel. Um, Beating out, I think I Made a Game with Zombies in it was the number one at the time. So we were super pleased with that. The sales weren't amazing. I mean, they weren't terrible, but the review score was just you can't get much better than number one. And it didn't stay there permanently. I mean, a few weeks later another game came out, and eventually we got dethroned. But it was just very cool to get that kind of notice that, oh, we had this RPG that's just this silly parody thing, and people really liked it.
Yeah, I can say that your games had a reasonably successful reputation because I heard about them back when they were Xbox Live indie games, and that's not an easy feat for games on that channel.
Yeah,
Like if you weren't plugged into that community, very rarely do you hear about things that got released, and when you did, it wasn't the most positive of feedbacks.
yeah, there were a lot of games on the channel that weren't the highest quality that people would make fun of. So we were really lucky that people enjoyed what we were doing and spread it, and that's a big reason why we were able to get on Steam in the first place because back in 2010, 2011, Steam was very much a walled garden. You submitted your game and then they either accepted or rejected it, and there weren't a whole lot of indie RPGs or JRPGs on Steam, but we were able to show off the rave reviews that our Xbox Live indie games were getting and convince them to let us put up a bundle with Breath of Death and Cthulhu in it, and it did really well on Steam.
Speaking of bygone eras, the walled garden of Steam.
It's very different now.
Yeah, give it that. Like, so how did you go about porting Breath of Death and Cthulhu to Steam? Is that when you jumped into like Unity or something?
No, XNA was even though Microsoft built it primarily for Xbox 360, the indie service there, XNA, did work on Windows PCs. So it was really just a matter of taking the existing code that we had for the Xbox and adding stuff like keyboard support and adjusting the save code and stuff like that. So it wasn't a huge trial. Um, you know, all in all, probably one of the easier ports I've done, which is good because I had no experience. It was my first port, and we did a Kickstarter for the PC version to raise awareness and get some funds while I worked on it, and that did really well for us. And it was before Kickstarter was really a big thing, so I had no idea what was going to go on there. A friend of mine said, "Hey, there's this new thing called Kickstarter. You should try." It's like, okay, but yeah, we got great reception there. Got a few $1,000s, which not huge compared to something like Double Fine a year or two later, but was very helpful for us to get the thing working so that we could release it on Steam. And then, I checked recently, and if I'm not mistaken, the Cthulhu Breath of Death bundle has sold over 600,000 copies on Steam, which is a lot of copies. Admittedly, a lot of those were for like $1 or so, but still, a lot of people have played it.
I mean, that's still, nominally over $600,000. Like, I know that's not the actual number because there are fees and such on Steam, but still, it's
right,
not,
and it's over the course of a decade as well of worth of sales.
No, but believe me, there are a lot of indie titles, that would kill for such numbers.
Definitely.
And it's also not like that's been your only success, because you've certainly put out a lot of games over the years. Though before we depart from these particular titles, I should ask: did Breath of Death / Cthulhu Saves the World end up anywhere else?
Let's see. Cthulhu Saves the World had a mobile port that was done by a different dev team, and if I'm not mistaken, it no longer works. So right now, unless you have an old copy of the game on your Xbox 360, the only place you can get it is on Steam PC. We are working on porting it to additional platforms, hopefully later this year. So when we have more details on that, we'll let everybody know.
Oh, I was just about to ask if you were looking into remastering the game and such for modern platforms, but it seems like you are.
Yeah, we announced it a couple months ago, I think. And yeah, we're working on it, and when we have dates and platforms to announce, we will do so.
Are you guys working on the new ports, or is someone else handling that?
That is still under discussion.
I see. Anyway, so I think next up in your gameography is, got to admit, something that surprised me back in the day, not unwelcomely so, but still. You ended up developing the later two episodes of the Penny Arcade RPG series. And
yeah, so
go ahead.
what happened there is while we were working on Cthulhu Saves the World, I got an email from Robert Koo, who was the CEO of Penny Arcade at the time. And he said that they were looking to, they were really disappointed that their RPG series was just kind of stuck halfway. The original developer was done with it. They didn't want to make the rest of the series. And they had seen Breath of Death 7 and thought that maybe they could continue this series as more of a retro JRPG style. So they wanted to talk to us, and we were really surprised. And it's like, oh, cool, yeah, we're working on this game called Cthulhu Saves the World, but when we're done, we'd be happy to look into that. So they flew us up to Seattle to meet with them, and we talked to Robert Koo and Jerry Holkins primarily, and a couple other people that were on their staff that were, doing biz dev kind of stuff. And they were great. They were very appreciative of the stuff we were doing, and they gave us a lot of flexibility with making the games. So um, while Jerry Holkins was, the creator and um, the general writer, and he came up with the plot and all that. For the actual gameplay mechanics, they pretty much just gave us free reign to do whatever we wanted.
So it sounds like they weren't really concerned about continuity, so to speak. Because
No, I mean, he was, he really cared about the story and that aspect. But they were like, oh yeah, completely different style as the first two games. Go ahead.
Like, I mean, there's a lot of creators who wouldn't be so, allowable with their, with such parameters. But I suppose there wasn't much choice, given that what the first two games were very different, and working in a very different engine from your games, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, I believe they were 3D and had kind of a cell shaded sort of look, and gameplay wise, they were more like the Paper Mario games.
I mean, it's been a long while, but I played through all of the Rain Slick Precipice of Darkness games, and I do remember the first two playing like that. And did you play the first two episodes, or get any reference materials, in order to keep continuity with the first two?
Yeah, I don't think I had played them when they first contacted us, but of course, I took a look at them and played them afterwards to make sure I knew what we were dealing with. But of course, like I said, Jerry Holkins, he wrote all of the, he came up with the plot, and he was one of the two main Penny Arcade characters to begin with. So he worked on the plot, and he told us what needs to go into the third game and the fourth game, and what are the crucial things from the first two games that we need to make sure match up with the later games. And for anyone who hasn't played those games, they're still available on Steam, and actually we made them free. I think it was a year or two ago. So, and they're just like outright free. You just go to the page, click a button, they're added to your library. They're not freemium or anything. There's no ads. So, you like classic JRPGs and haven't played them, be sure to give them a shot.
And were you still working in XNA at that point in time?
Yeah, those were the last games I made with XNA.
And how did things evolve from the Penny Arcade games to, from Breath of Death and Cthulhu Saves the World? Because I do remember, the Penny Arcade games being a lot more, not so much in depth, but a lot longer than your first two endeavors.
Yeah, Breath of Death was by far the shortest, and then Cthulhu was noticeably longer than that. And then Penny Arcade 3 and 4 were probably the same length as Cthulhu, or maybe slightly longer. We tried to do different things with each game, like with the first Penny Arcade game that we worked on, we changed the battle system up so it had more of a time bar, had some inspiration from the Grandia series, and there was also a job system where you could get a bunch of crazy jobs and attach them to your characters and have 3 jobs active at once, which I've seen in some RPGs, but it's not super common. And then with the 4th game, we were like, okay, we don't want to just do a rehash of the 3rd game, so we kind of made it vaguely Pokemon-esque, where you would go and recruit different weird monsters or characters to your team, and then equip them with different jobs or trainers to give them different abilities. So that was a bit different, and also we had the party split up, so you'd have there were 2 major parties going through the game, and eventually they team up and meet together for the later part of the game. I remember with the 4th game, we really tried to make the individual scenarios more interesting. Like we had a demon train that you had to go through as a dungeon that was heavily inspired by Final Fantasy VI's Ghost Train. And I remember that was a lot of fun to design, since it was a very different format for a dungeon.
Like, and I'm trying to remember if the Penny Arcade games made it outside of like Xbox and PCs back in the day.
No, if I'm not mistaken, those were our last Xbox releases, and we also had Steam, and I think Penny Arcade may have paid for a mobile port for the first one, but I can't remember for sure. And if they did, it's long defunct and doesn't work with modern technology.
Right, because those games are about a decade old now.
Yeah, like 2013, I think. 12, 13, around then.
Like, anyway, so moving onwards, I think we come to. I hesitate to use this designation, but it seems to be the game that Zeboyd Games is perhaps most well known for. And that's Cosmic Star Heroine.
hmm Yeah, Cosmic Star Heroine was our big game after the Penny Arcade games. We decided we wanted to do something bigger, so we were going to go to Kickstarter and get some extra funds so we could spend a little longer. And while we were doing pre-production and planning stuff out, we were contacted by Sony, by someone named Shane Bedenhausen, who was and still is a big proponent of JRPGs, and he's one of their main people at Sony working with third parties like indie teams. And he came to us and said that he liked what we were working on, and they would really like to have our games on the PlayStation. And we thought, hey, that seems great. We want to do that too. So we worked on a little teaser trailer, with also with Dean Dodrell, or Dodrell, I think is how you pronounce it.
Dean Dodrell.
Yeah, who's best known for Dust and Elysian Tale. He's a developer friend of ours. Yeah. Well, excellent. Has he been on the podcast before?
Yeah. It's been an age because it's been an age since he last released a game.
Wasn't he still on in the Talk Shoe era for us?
True, but he did release something for the Switch. It was that tactical game. It's been a long while since he's released something, so there hasn't exactly been anything to talk about with him. So
Right. Yeah. I know what he's working on something, and I know what it is.
Mhm.
He's shown me a couple things and sworn me to secrecy, so I will not give any details beyond that. But he
I
is
mean,
working
NDAs
on
are
something.
NDAs.
Yeah.
Yeah, friend DA.
Friend.
we've had we've actually had people break those, and
Yeah.
it
That's a
yeah.
fun time in the editing den.
Yes. Or wait, no, it wasn't. It was quite annoying.
Yeah, that one.
Anyway,
Yeah, so Dean helped us, uh, helped participate in a teaser trailer that we did for Cosmic Star Heroine, that Sony showed off at an indie developer meetup that they did, and it was very interesting. I remember they were showing off Dive Kick at that place, which was the first time I had seen that. And they had our little trailer, and all the technical issues just happened at once, and like the music wasn't working, and
God, that's a
you know
mood.
but it was no big deal. So yeah, we worked on that for quite a while. We had a successful Kickstarter with it. We thought it would take about a year and a half or so. It did not. Our scope was a bit, our scope was too big. We were trying to do too much, and it would have been a better, experience if we had reined it in a bit. But I'm very pleased with the final game. Think it's lots of fun. Still get comments from people saying they loved it, and they want a sequel. No sequel plans at the moment, but you never know in the future what that might bring. And also Cosmic Star Hero, and that was the first game that I made with Unity. So there was a lot of learning experience there. It was the first and only game I made for the Vita, which was, a big thing because like I was a huge Vita fan just as a gamer, and I love portable systems. So I was working on the game for PC, and Sony eventually sent us a dev kit for the PlayStation 4 because we were releasing it on the PS4, but we didn't have the highest priority because we weren't making a huge AAA game, and we didn't need it because our game was still a ways off. And so I was working on it, testing it on the PC and the PS4, and then eventually we got a Vita dev kit, and I tried to run the game, and like it immediately crashed, and the game was just not optimized enough for the Vita, so I had to restructure a lot of stuff and do a lot of rejiggering of the code just to get the thing to run. But eventually, it worked.
like, uh, was that like a pre-release dev kit?
um, I'm trying
You
to
know,
think. The with the PS4, we got the dev kits after the system itself came out.
okay.
Um, and the Vita was already out because I was a big fan. And they actually sent me launch day PS4, which I was really grateful for. And it actually arrived like the day before the official launch. So I was super stoked about that. I was like, "Oh, I've got a PS4, and I can do all the mandatory update downloads before everyone gets onto the server and breaks it."
Uh, technology, especially modern technology.
And the Vita version of Cosmic Star Heroine didn't do anything too special sales wise, because at that point the Vita was well on its way out, and
Right.
but it was super helpful because later when we had a Switch version of the game, all that optimization to get the thing running on the Vita meant that the Switch version was a real easy port and ran really well.
I would imagine, especially because they're using relatively similar hardware.
Yeah, I mean the Switch is way more powerful than the Vita, so you know the
Fair.
fact that it could run at like 30 frames per second on the Vita meant that the Switch was like 60 frames per second, and the load times were faster and just less likely to crash.
Right. I do remember, back in the day, hearing that you were having problems getting the game on the Switch because of Nintendo.
Yeah, that was basically I was just having trouble getting a hold of anybody at Nintendo. Like they were very back then they were still very much in the idea of just work with established companies, larger businesses, and not as much with tiny indie operations like us. And so in the end, we went with Limited Run Games, um, who did the Cosmic Star Hero and Switch port, and they also did a physical release for the game for PlayStation, Switch, and Vita. And that did really well for us. And also, it was really cool because they did a special collector's edition for the PlayStation, the Vita versions. So it had like a Sega CD style box because the game was very, heavily in that kind of style. Big fan of the Lunar games, and it had a big manual and music CDs with it, and just random other trinkets in it. So I was really pleased with how that went. And the physical edition, I remember, sold pretty well. We sold, I think it was around 15,000 across the three different consoles, which, I mean, that's nothing for a big AAA game, but for a tiny indie physical release, I thought it was really good.
Naturally, and I'm trying to figure out the right way to phrase that. Here we go. What lessons were learned on the Cosmic Heroine experience, given its trials and tribulations?
Mhm. Yeah, with Cosmic Star Heroine, I learned. I mean, a big thing is just I learned that I don't like these huge mega productions. I mean, life is short, and if you spend 3 years, 4 years, 5 years on a single game, you're not making that many games. So that was a big thing that I learned, that I just wanted to do small, more frequent, smaller releases rather than spend years and years on a single game.
I mean,
Also learned. Oh yeah, go ahead.
that is understandable, um, given how long Cosmic Star Heroine took to get out the door. Like,
Mhm.
but it's like even developing quote unquote small games can take a long time to do, as we have many, many, many testimonials to that effect. So I'm wondering, how do you go about keeping the scope in check for your projects these days?
Yeah, I think the big thing is uh, just first of all realizing that just because it's an RPG doesn't mean that it has to be an epic ordeal. I'm huge fan of Persona, Dragon Quest, and these are games that could be 50 hours to 100 hours long. But
Mhm.
sometimes I'm just in the mood for something short and sweet, something you could play in like 5 hours or 10 hours and get a full experience. And there's plenty of games like that in other genres, but in RPGs, they're more scarce, with most RPGs being, big, long things that you have to dedicate weeks or months to. So just deciding off the bat, okay, we want this game to be like 5 hours or 6 hours long. That's what we're going to shoot for. Just having that scope to begin with helps, make it so that you're not spending years and years on a single project.
I mean, it's a good mantra to have, especially working in the RPG field, which is almost by definition a very time intensive, probably if not the most, one of the most required for time investment. So
yeah, and I mean, when you look at stuff like Persona 5 or Like a Dragon, or we've have Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth coming out, very soon. A tiny indie team really can't compete against any of those, directly. We don't have the money to put tons of cool anime cutscenes or CGI effects. We don't have the staff to make a game that's going to take you 60 hours to complete with, 100 different side quests. We don't have the um, money to do something that's going to push modern hardware to the limit. So you really just have to pick a niche and try to focus on it. So while they can make these big epic games, we can do silly comedy games or games with unusual premises. Not just us, but like any indie RPG developer out there. We can do those short but sweet games that maybe the large companies can't justify because they need to sell millions of copies with each game that they release.
Well, an interesting thing, we haven't touched upon it yet, but I think this is a good point to do so, is, another way, at least in the titles I've played, that you manage to keep the scale down is your titles have a very rapid fire pace to them. For those who haven't yet played a Zeboyd RPG, there are variances, of course, but the battles are streamlined to keep them very short. And including there's this timer mechanic, like going all the way back to Breath of Death in Cthulhu, where each round the enemy will get stronger, and that puts a pressure point on completing things fast. And I'm wondering where that came from.
Yeah. So when we first started making RPGs, like I said, I thought, I want to make short, sweet RPGs, comedies. I want to, just get rid of any possible annoyances or frustration points. And, there's plenty of games that this isn't a case, but, lots of people complain about having to grind in RPGs where you just have to fight a bunch of extra battles so that you're strong enough to beat the boss. And I was like, okay, I don't want any of that. I want it to be fast paced, keep turn based, but make it so that combat, is quick, because the quicker turn based gameplay is, the more interesting it is, because that means you're making more choices on what you're going to do next. So with Breath of Death and Cthulhu, our combat system is really fast. Part of that is because there's very limited animation. But like with Breath of Death, you can go pretty much as fast as you can hit the confirm button. If it's an easy battle that you don't have to think very hard on. And we've tried to keep that even, as our graphics and animations become more elaborate. That focus on, fast-paced, turn-based combat is just plain more interesting than slow turn-based combat.
Like, and how has that changed over the course of your titles?
Well, with the later titles, we've tended to go towards fewer battles, but making the individual battles more involved. Like with Cosmic Star Heroine and with This Way Madness Lies. In both of those games, you can see where combat's going to take place, and you can, in some instances, you're able to avoid the enemies and keep going. So with the combat specifically designed to be at different locations in the dungeons, it's just works out better to have fewer battles, but make those battles more interesting, and so they're not as fast as our original games with Breath of Death and Cthulhu. But overall, I think we found a good balance.
Quality over quantity.
Right.
No. I can see the argument, especially since that it's been one of the eternal struggles of the RPG genre. How to combat the monotony of the day-to-day battles, if you will. Like, different developers have come up with different solutions. I'm still a fan of the Earthbound method personally. But
yeah, where you
not a lot
just
of
auto
people
win battles if they're too easy.
Yes. And there's a more dynamic way of approaching than a lot of other RPGs that use the same kind of, you can see the enemies on field.
Yeah, I think going back to, I don't know, maybe Game Boy Advance eras, people had figured out that, like, I know Golden Sun tried to do this as best as possible. If you're going to have the true random battle things, make them really quick and easy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's one of the things that makes going back to, like actual 8-bit RPGs a slog. There's really no other way to put it. But, that was the limitations of the time. Thankfully, even though your games are in the stylings of 8 and 16-bit RPGs, you don't feel the need to keep to the traditions of those titles. It's like no one wants to relive the bad stuff from those eras. And, I'm not saying
Right.
that, the RPG grind is bad or anything, but it can get monotonous, especially like back in the NES eras where everything was a lot more limited. Like,
Yeah, and I've found that if you want to hit that nostalgia feeling for a lot of people, oftentimes you want to aim for their memories more than the reality. So
mm-hmm,
like you said, you don't necessarily want to have all the grinding that some of the old games had. Sometimes, you don't want to have the exact same graphical limitations that an old 8-bit or a 16-bit system had. You want to
mm-hmm.
uh, have the general feel of it, but maybe do it a little better, because we find that matches more of what people's memories of that era are. Because
Right.
over time it gets bigger and better over time in their minds of, oh, I love that game. And if they actually went back and played it, maybe they wouldn't love it as much. And but at the time, it was an amazing thing, so they were able to overlook some of its weaknesses.
Yeah. It's also other things like, a lot of people who played, let's say, the original Final Fantasy or Dragon Warrior back in the day were like 8 to 10 years old. when they played it, so they had a lot more time to invest in RPGs. Like, and so they could take the actual time to grind out, as opposed to now when those people are in their 30s or 40s, and they have jobs, lives, and what have you, and don't necessarily have the capacity to invest in an RPG these days.
True, and also a lot of those early games, they pretty much needed the grind to flesh out the time. like something like Persona 5,
Mm-hmm.
that's like 90 or 100 hours, and there's very little like what we would consider grind there. It's all story and
Yeah.
gameplay content. We're pressing forward, but like
Well,
something like the original Dragon Warrior, there's like if there was no grind, you'd finish the game in an hour or two.
yeah. I mean, even with the grind, you can actually finish. Well, you can finish the original Dragon Warrior pretty quickly. Um, it's like, even by NES standards, it's fairly small.
Hmm.
That's more how much bigger, say, Dragon Warrior 3 is to Dragon Warrior 1 or Dragon Quest these days. But
Yeah, but like even like Dragon Quest 2 or 3, you're probably looking at like 20 or 30-hour long games. You know,
no, yeah,
even even with the grind.
yeah. I mean, though, even back in, say, the 16-bit era, you did have RPGs that were a lot more concise than others. It's one of the differences between, say, Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. Like,
Hmm.
Chrono Trigger is one of the greatest RPGs, one of the greatest games of all time. But it's a short RPG. It's always been a short RPG. I think you can beat it in 20 hours. Like, whereas
Shorter
Final
than that if you
Fantasy,
get good enough RMG on the first Labos fight.
well, that's New Game Plus. Like,
Fair.
Yeah.
that's a different thing. Especially the way Chrono Trigger does it. Whereas
Mhm.
Final Fantasy VI, I remember that being the RPG where I sunk about 70 hours or whatever into it. So, um, anyway, getting back on track here, because the time is draining. Your more recent titles have been Cthulhu Saves Christmas, um, and This Way Madness Lies. Um, so, starting with Cthulhu Saves Christmas, what prompted you to revisit this version of Cthulhu, let's say?
Yeah. So with Cthulhu, there were always ideas to do a sequel at some point, but we hadn't really acted on it. One idea was to do Cthulhu Saves the Galaxy and make it more sci-fi oriented. But after Cosmic Star Heroine being sci-fi, we weren't really in the mood for that. And then, one day, just doing some brainstorming, and it was probably Christmas time. We were watching cheesy Hallmark movies, and we thought this would just be too funny to throw Cthulhu into this. And once we had that original idea, the rest of the ideas came really quickly on how we would set it up. Yeah, so that was Cthulhu Saves Christmas, and then with This Way Madness Lies, I wanted to do a magical girl RPG for a while, because like I said, I'm a big Persona fan, which has a lot of the same sort of elements, where you have teenagers who have regular lives, but then they turn into superheroes at night and fight evil. Um, so just thinking about that, and then we're thinking, oh, so how do we make this interesting so it's not just a magical girl game, but it has a twist? And my wife suggested, oh, Shakespeare. Shakespeare has lots of strong women in its plays. So base all the characters on Shakespeare heroines and base some of your scenarios on Shakespeare plays, and thought that was a great idea, so we went with that.
Like, inspired. Like, so how long ago did This Way Madness Lies come out?
Trying to think. I'll just look it up. I've been doing this long enough that I forget stuff. So, the Steam version came out November 2022, and we released a PS5 version and a Switch version last year. So it's available Switch, PlayStation 5, and Steam.
Yeah. Like, and have you approached Xbox about getting your titles back into that ecosystem at any point?
We've done some talking. Cosmic Star Heroine was intended to be released on Xbox, but there's just a series of misfortune where just different events conspire to make it difficult. And since then, we've talked to their indie team a few times, and ultimately, it just hasn't really worked out. A big thing for us was that with our games, we've discovered that the physical releases are a big help. Both the direct sales from selling physical and also the added attention. And the company that we did physical with, Limited Run Games, is much more set up to do releases on the Switch and on PlayStation platforms than they are on Xbox. So without that physical push for additional sales and publicity, it's hard to be able to make an Xbox release work. If we could get some sort of Game Pass deal, then we would 100% jump on that and be sure to release our games there. But for the time being, we're focusing on Steam and Switch and whatever Nintendo releases next, and PlayStation.
And speaking of such things, can you delve into what you're working on now?
Yeah, so the big thing that we're doing right now is Zombie Fun Run, which is a comedy RPG, turn-based. It is currently up on Kickstarter. So yeah, spread the word, let everyone know. Be sure to check it out and back it, and tell your friends. And Zombie Fun Run is unique among the games I've worked on because I am working with my daughter on that one. She's the lead artist and also a co-writer on the game. So it's been tons of fun working with her. I think it's going to be a hysterical game. She also helped a lot with This Way Madness Lies, the story there and writing there, which we got a lot of praise for about how funny the game was. So, that was the first game that she worked on, and she's taking a bigger role with this game. So it's going to be awesome.
I think that's a new one for the show. We haven't yet, until this point, had a developer involving their child in the development business. So kudos.
Well, learn the family trade.
How old is your daughter?
She's late teens.
Oh. I gotta admit, I was expecting a bit younger. But still, it's good that she wants to learn how to program and make games and such.
Yep, and she's already a great artist and a great writer. Like I said, This Way Madness Lies got lots of good reviews and praise about its story, and she was a big part of the writing there.
Well, hopefully, this outing ends up being, as fulfilling as This Way Madness Lies was, I'm presuming. Like,
Hmm.
I do wish you luck on the Kickstarter, especially since I'm looking at the numbers here, and it's a bit of a concern. If I'm being honest. Yeah.
Well, the way Kickstarter works, you
Right.
always tend to get a big rush at the end. So we're doing everything we can to spread the word these last week or so
Mhm.
to try to get over the goal.
Yeah. And you can find that at kickstarter.com/projects/Zeboyd/zombie fun run. I'm sure somebody will put it in the main chat. It's in the Discord. If you wish to look at it. And yeah, I think we have come to the end point. Since it's now noon and people have to get jobs and stuff.
Yes, I need to get to work. It has been nice
Um,
talking to you, but I'm going to drop now.
Yeah. Petty, before we close, is there anything you want to ask since you've been playing This Way Madness Lies for the past hour?
No, I think I'm good.
Right. Robert, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule and being with us here today. It has been a pleasure talking about your games for the past hour. And we look forward to seeing how Zombie Fun Run shapes out. And, hopefully we can have you on the program when, that is more fully formed and ready to be talked about in the details.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah, that would be great.
yeah. Till then, you can find Zeboyd games. You can find pretty much the whole gamut on Steam. And their modern games are both on PlayStation and Switch. So if you have an hankering for a old school RPG with modern sensibilities and more importantly modern quality of life improvements, be sure to pick up one of these today. All right, so that'll about do it for this installment of Fragments Silicon. As always, be sure to tune in next time for our Sunday review session. Until then, I shall wish you good gaming.